Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. For your information, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our RemPlex webpage. As a reminder, we request that you please keep yourself muted during the presentation and during the Q&A session as well at the end of the presentation. My name is Nick Chafogu, and I'm with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I will be moderating today's seminar on behalf of the Center for the Remediation of Complex Sites, RemPlex. RemPlex is a PNNL platform that couples unique core capabilities and expertise with state-of-the-art facilities and physical assets to develop, mature, and deploy advanced technologies to solve complex issues of contaminated subsurface environment. Today's seminar is co-authored by Chris Johnson of PNNL and Mark Byrnes of the Central Plateau Cleanup Company. We are really excited about today's seminar because this is the first RemPlex seminar co-authored by a PNNL and a Hanford DOE contractor staff member. And in this case, the contractor is the Central Plateau Cleanup Company that was just established at the Hanford site. The seminar will discuss the processes involved with assessing performance data and following the soil vapor extraction guidance to present evidence to terminate the soil vapor extraction remediation system in the 200 PW1 Operable Unit at the US Department of Energy Hanford site. The authors of today's seminar have made outstanding contribution for many decades and are well-known researchers in the complex site remediation community. Chris Johnson has been involved with environmental restoration research and development at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory since 1992. He has designed and implemented ex situ and in situ bioremediation systems for treatment of hydrocarbon and chlorinated solvents at a variety of DOE, DOD, and private sites. Chris has co-authored guidance document describing a structured process to evaluate performance and endpoints for pump and treat and soil vapor extraction remedies. Chris has developed multiple software tools that support remediation decision, including the RT3D code for multiple species reactive transport simulation, the Socrates web-based tool set for analysis of water level and contaminant pollutant and remediation system data, and the SVEET software for assessing the impact of vadose zone contaminant source on groundwater and soil gas extraction and concentrations. Mark Byrnes has been involved in environmental sites characterization and remediation projects at DOE, DOD, and private industry since 1985 and in many, many sites. Over the last 26 years, he has been working at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, where he has served as the project manager responsible for the recovery of chlorinated solvents, radionuclides, and other contaminants from the vadose zone and groundwater, using a set of technologies such as soil vapor extraction, ion exchange, bioreactor, and air stripping. Currently, Mark it's an author of a textbook titled Field Sampling Methods for Remedial Investigation. And he is currently working with a CRC press to write the third edition of this kind of a famous textbook because it has been used in many universities across the country. He periodically teaches courses on environmental sciences at Washington State University here at the Tri-Cities. During and after the presentation, I please encourage you to submit any questions that you might have via the chat box, which will be monitored, and those questions will be passed along to Chris and Mark for further discussions. I will be posting a link in the chat box to a RemPlex survey where we invite you all to provide feedback on today's seminar and offer recommendations for future topics. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris and later to Mark to kick us off today. Go ahead, Chris. It's
Great,
all
thank you. All right. So as Nick said, we're going to be talking about the performance analysis to look at endpoints for soil vapor extraction remedy at Hanford, where the challenge was really to determine what is the endpoint for this soil vapor extraction remedy. Do we need to optimize the system? Do we need a different technology, or are we ready to turn this thing off while still protecting human health and the environment? The approach we took was to apply some guidance for Vadosone VOC contaminant sources using a structured process of evaluating the data, estimating impacts, and using decision logic to determine the outcome for the remedy. So this was a great project. Mark and I are excited to present about it because it demonstrated a successful collaboration of Hanford contractors, RL, to provide the sound technical basis to the EPA for making remedial decisions and validating the guidance document in the process. And I'll mention, so Mark led the effort with project scientist Virginia Rohe as part of the Hanford soil and groundwater cleanup contractor, which at the time was CH2M Hill Plateau Remediation Company, and has just recently transitioned to the Central Plateau Cleanup Company. We had Freestone Environmental Services was another contractor that provided some fieldwork and data management support. It was really helpful for that. And then PNNL had a role in terms of the guidance and evaluating the impacts and the performance. So it was a great team effort. So today, I'll talk about the performance assessment guidance as the context for assessing the 200 PW1 OU in the Vadosone. Mark will talk about the site background and the operational history and the data that we collected in support of this assessment. And then I'll get into the conceptual site model, the updated regulatory context. We looked at the impacts of the remaining contamination, and all that led to our performance assessment recommendations and the outcome for the site remedy. So PNNL, along with the Corps of Engineers and EPA, put together a guidance document for Vadosone contaminant sources to look at soil vapor extraction and when do you, how do you assess the endpoint? Are you going to optimize, transition, close the site? Where are you headed with your remedy? And that guidance formed the basis for a path forward plan that PNNL and the cleanup contractors put together to look at how are we going to specifically look at the 200 PW1 operable unit. And it was essentially an agreement between DOE and EPA for the approach and structure for doing this assessment. When are we going to terminate SVE operations? The performance assessment guidance document provides a process, a multi-step process here, which really starts out with revisiting the conceptual site model. We need to take new data that may have been acquired during operation of the SVE beyond what was available at the time of the initial characterization and RFS process and incorporate that. We need to look at the environmental pathways and regulatory context, and again, make sure we're updated with anything new that's happened over time. And then quantify the impacts of the remaining Vadosone source contamination, which all this feeds into this decision logic to determine what kind of outcome is appropriate. Are we ready to close the site, optimize, transition to a different technology, and so on. So that led us to a site-specific flow path here for assessing the closure and path forward. Again, I had the three major decision steps. The initially just, do we have the right data for an adequate, well-defined CSM? What's new with the environmental pathways and risk and regulatory context? Do we understand all that well enough to support decisions? And then finally do the assessment of the impacts and work through the decision logic to see, do we need to keep going? Are we ready to turn the system off? Do we need some optimization? Those sort of questions that we're trying to answer with that decision logic. So that's the overall context for the performance assessment and endpoint evaluation. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk about the site background.
Thank you very much, Chris. Those of you that may not be as familiar with the Hanford site, it's 586 square miles in size, and it's located in southeastern Washington state. As you can see from the figure on the right, the Columbia River goes through the Hanford site. And for 40 years, Hanford was used for plutonium production starting in the 1940s. There were 9 nuclear reactors located along the river, and up on the Central Plateau, near the central part of Hanford, were the process facilities. It is the world's largest environmental cleanup project. The 200 PW1 operable unit that we'll be talking about today is located up on the Central Plateau in the West area. Soil column received liquid waste from plutonium separation operations. Next slide, please. Liquid waste was disposed of from 1955 through 1973 at 3 different facilities. It was the Z9 trench on the right, the Z1A tile field in the center, and the Z18 crib in the lower left. Aqueous waste containing high concentrations of carbon tetrachloride were released into these structures. Soil vapor extraction operations were used to recover carbon tetrachloride from the Veda zone between 1992 and 2012. Next slide, please. Y'all can be looking at the timeline at the bottom of the slide as I talk through this. In 1992, an action memorandum was signed by the Environmental Protection Agency that allowed soil vapor extraction operations to start as part of an interim action. Then between 1992 and 2012, active soil vapor extraction operations were performed at the 3 waste sites that I pointed out on the previous slide. More emphasis in the later years was placed on the Z9 trench and the Z1A tile field. Between the years 2000 and 2013, passive soil vapor extraction operations were also implemented at the Z1A trench, the Z1A tile field, and the Z18 crib. Then in 2011, the final record decision for the PW1 operable unit was finalized and issued. Soil vapor extraction was selected as part of the final remedial action. Next slide, please, Chris. This cartoon on the right-hand side just demonstrates how a soil vapor extraction system operates. But before we talk about that, I wanted to point out the Cold Creek unit, which is a caliche layer that's located about 100 feet below the ground surface. We installed our extraction wells, soil vapor extraction wells, that would be sometimes screening above the Cold Creek unit. Sometimes it was screened only below the Cold Creek unit, and sometimes it would be screened both above and below the Cold Creek unit in our wells. As the wells were drilled, we collected soil gas samples with depth, and that data was used to identify the optimum length and positioning of the screened intervals. A vacuum blower was used to help develop a vacuum. As you can see, the arrows the air is pulled through the formation as the arrows are showing into the well, pulled up the well through a flow meter, through an air-water separator that helped remove moisture from the air, and then through a heat exchanger, then through a granulated activated carbon canister, and then through a gas chromatograph before the clean air was then released into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Between 1992 and 1997, we used 3 soil vapor extraction systems of different sizes. One was a 500 CFM unit, the other one was a 1,000 CFM unit, and third one was a 1,500 CFM unit. And these were operated continuously 365 days a year. And during that period of time, we recovered 74,851 kilograms of carbon tetrachloride. A 1-year rebound study was then performed in 1997. And after that time, we only utilized the 500 CFM unit from that point on, and we only operated it 6 months out of the year. And that would be between the years of 1998 and 2008. And we alternated moving the 500 CFM unit between each of the waste sites. The system was put in standby mode the remaining 6 months out of the year that allowed the vapor to rebound. Between the year of 2009, I should say in the year 2009, we actually purchased 2 brand new 500 CFM SVE units. And we used them between 2009 and 2012. And during that period, we operated them between 6 and 8 months out of the year with a rebound in between. Next slide, please. A total of 80,107 kilograms of carbon tetrachloride was recovered through the year 2012. 93% of that mass was recovered in the first 6 years of operation, as shown in the diagram to the right, with diminishing returns as time went on. Next slide, please. The illustration on the right shows the maximum carbon tetrachloride concentration at the end of each operational cycle as a green circle that are at the lower end of the figure. And it also shows the concentration after a rebound period, which was shown as either a yellow or a green diamond. You can see the action level on the diagram at 100 ppmv, and the readings that were above that level were yellow color and the ones below it were green color. I wanted to point out, it's in it's hard to see the year there, but I think it's 1996 to 1997, the first year that's on the diagram there. Yeah, the time when we shut the system off there at 20 ppmv and then allowed it to rebound, the following year you can see the concentrations up around 125 ppmv as the yellow, yeah, the level yellow position right there. As the years progress, though, you could see the amount of rebound continue to get lower and less over time. So, okay, next slide, please. This diagram here basically shows a comparison of the maximum concentration detected in each of the individual wells to the concentration in the year of 2013. If we take the first well, I think that's W15-81 or 82. The original concentration was 28,500 ppmb. And by the time we were done, it was basically below detection. The tannish, brownish colored columns are the well concentrations in the wells at the year 2013. You can see the cleanup level is identified as a dashed line going across there. And that is a logarithmic scale on the vertical. And next slide, please. The figure on the right-hand side shows the well locations where soil vapor extraction was performed. The green color indicates that the wells are below the action level. The data reported here is in 2015. The two diamond shapes that are yellow color were slightly above the cleanup level. One was at 125 ppmv on the left, and the one on the right is 103 ppmv. Next slide, please. In the year 2012, PNNL performed a treatability test at the Z9 trench. And that test concluded that the remaining carbon tetrachloride levels have no longer any adverse impact on the underlying groundwater. The only remaining source of carbon tetrachloride is contained within the Cold Creek unit. And from the diagram there, the remaining carbon tetrachloride source area was estimated to be about 90 meters by 90 meters in size. Next slide, please. Extensive site characterization work was performed to assess all potential contamination source areas overlying the groundwater contamination plume in the 200 West area. And I would like to note that the size of that plume in the groundwater is about 7 square miles. This characterization was performed to develop an accurate conceptual site model. The characterization activities included initially performing a passive soil gas sampling effort that encompassed all of the potential source areas. Based on the results from those passive soil gas samples, active soil gas sampling was then performed at the locations showing elevated readings. Also, we purposefully targeted pipelines that could have been leaking. Soil samples were then collected at locations where the active soil gas location showed elevated readings. Next slide, please. The CERCLA remedial investigation feasibility study characterization activities concluded there are no other sources of carbon tetrachloride besides the 3 disposal sites, the Z9 trench, the Z1A tile field, and the Z18 crib. The remaining carbon tetrachloride source is within the Cold Creek unit. Next slide. I'll be turning this back over to Chris now.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. So you can see all the data that was collected fed into updating the conceptual site model, which has evolved over time. Initially, there was a lot of contamination in the vadose zone as well as the groundwater. We applied soil vapor extraction, cleaned up a lot of that by 1997. And then by 2015, the remaining contamination was in that Cold Creek unit. And so that feeds into our performance analysis process. The other thing that occurred was the signing of the ROD in 2011, which identified the two COCs as carbon tetrachloride and methylene chloride. And it stated a remedial action objective number 3, which applied to the vadose zone, was to control the source of contamination to protect the groundwater. It defined cleanup levels of 100 ppmv for carbon tet and 50 for methylene chloride, but noted that those cleanup levels need to be further refined and assessed to ensure they're protective of the groundwater. And then SVE, as we said, was selected as the final remedial action for soil vapor, continuing the interim action. So we looked again at environmental pathways. There was a pathways and risk assessment and a baseline risk assessment document where groundwater was defined as the only pathway. Risk is assessed as part of the ZP1 OU groundwater remedy. So that's a separate operable unit, ZP1. And I want to note here that carbon tet's the controlling factor for remediation. The carbon tet's remaining in the Cold Creek unit is a continuing source. Methylene chloride is identified as a COC in the ROD, but it was not disposed. It's present at low concentrations as a result of historical anaerobic degradation conditions. And so there's no continuing source of methylene chloride. So carbon tet is really the controlling parameter as we look at endpoints for this remedy. So the soil vapor extraction in-state tool was used to calculate soil vapor impacts on the groundwater. This is a companion software tool to the SVE guidance that PNNL and Corps of Engineers and EPA published. And it has a couple of assumptions that are relevant here, including that we assume the underlying aquifer is clean and there's no carbon tet sources in the groundwater. And it assumes that the vadose zone source remains constant over time. So using this tool, we estimated groundwater impact for the source for the 3 different sites. Is shown here, source strengths, and then the impact to the groundwater with the maximum of 27 micrograms per liter at the Z9 site. And these estimates were consistent with the 216 Z9 trench treatability test estimates that were also performed separately. In terms of actual conditions, there's really no impact. The groundwater contains greater than 300 micrograms per liter of carbon tets in the area under the Z9 trench. And so at those concentrations in the groundwater, we don't have mass transfer into the groundwater. So the vadose zone contamination doesn't currently impact. So the other thing we did was looked at the context over the overall remedies and looking at this over time. So we have the vadose zone PW1 operable unit, the groundwater ZP1 operable unit, where in the groundwater, pump and treat is being performed, and then that's going to be followed by monitored natural attenuation with an overall cleanup level in the groundwater of 3.4 micrograms per liter. So we looked at what's the estimated impact over time. And by 2050, the remaining vadose zone source contaminant, carbon tet contamination, will not have an impact above 3.4 micrograms per liter. It's 27 back here, but by 2050, it's going to be 3.4 or less is the impact. But if we look at the actual groundwater concentrations, the pump and treat is expected to bring concentrations down to 100 by about 2035. And then monitored natural attenuation will bring those further down to the cleanup target by about 2135. So we've estimated the impact of the vadose zone source on groundwater, and this work constitutes that refinement required by the ROD to look at the cleanup levels. And we documented this work in the treatability test report, as well as our action plans here. And this shows that we are meeting remedial active objective number 3 in terms of protecting the groundwater from vadose contamination. So that aspect is met. So the conclusions of this performance and endpoint assessment was that SVE was very effective for vadose carbon tetch removal. And again, through 2012, we removed over 80,000 kilograms of carbon tetch. The ROD defined the remedial action objectives and remedy, with groundwater being the only exposure pathway. We had a well-defined conceptual site model with no unknown sources, and the remaining vadose carbon tetch source is not causing and will not cause groundwater cleanup levels to be exceeded. So we calculated this impact to be less than the cleanup goal of 3.4 micrograms per liter within 40 years. We met the RAO3, and risk and exposure from the groundwater is addressed within the groundwater remedy. Therefore, we had some recommendations, and the primary recommendation was to discontinue the soil vapor extraction. We suggested that groundwater monitoring only be performed, because groundwater is the risk driver here. And we recommended that we prepare a response action report to close out the SVE portion of the PW1 operable unit remedy. EPA, this was presented to EPA, and they concurred with the assessment and recommendations. So they signed off in 2016 on the response action report to indicate their concurrence. And subsequently, the SVE system was terminated, and the system was demobilized, ending a successful remedy after a little more than 20 years. So if we look at the impact and broader application of this, it demonstrates the utility of well thought out guidance to provide a structured approach for evaluating this remediation performance and determining endpoints. And this guidance and approach fit well with adaptive management of waste sites. It's important to incorporate information that you get as you operate a remedy, and not just select the remedy and keep operating it forever, but rather adapt to changes in your conceptual site model and new information, and do the performance analysis to see where are we at with this remedy. Are we actually having an impact on groundwater, or if you had a site with vapor intrusion, what are those impacts? Do you need to keep operating the remedy? Do you need to bolster the remedy, do something more active, or can you just let it go with natural attenuation? So the PW1 operable unit is a part of a complex site. A lot of challenges that we had to deal with here in terms of subsurface materials, the Coal Creek unit. We have concurrent remedies going on. And this was a great case study because it resulted in protection of groundwater, but also a cost savings. Again, we're not continuing to run the soil vapor extraction system when it's not needed to be protective. So it was a great template for endpoint evaluations at other sites, and also a great template for collaboration at Hanford. I have a list of references here. So if folks are looking for some more information, they can check out these references in terms of some of the path forward documents, the response action report, the guidance documents that we have. So and with that, I will turn it back over to Nick, and we can address any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris and Mark. That was a great presentation. We do have a couple of questions to start us off. The first one is, if the current impact to clean groundwater was estimated to be about 27 micrograms per liter, what is the basis for an impact less than the cleanup goal, let's say in about 40 years?
Great, that's a great question. So the SVE tool that we have can estimate current conditions. What would you expect the impact to groundwater be? What we took advantage of was the treatability test at the Z9 trench, which went a little further to look at actually depletion of the source. So SVE assumes a constant source, but we can look at how that source might deplete over time. And that's really what comes into play here, is that after about 40 years, the diffusion of the source material depletes it, and we end up with the impact being at the cleanup goals or below.
All right. Thanks, Chris. We do have another question. The site at Hanford has had a lot of characterization studies and monitoring performed in it. How well would this performance assessment approach that you guys described work for a site with fewer studies?
So another good question. Hanford is a complex site, has a lot of work that's been done there. Not all sites have as much characterization. And what I would say is that's not going to hinder your assessment of the endpoints.
Mhm.
The suite tool that is a companion to the guide document really takes just a handful of inputs to describe your site in terms of geometry, where's the source located, what's the strength of the source, some of the subsurface properties, moisture content, things like recharge, groundwater flow rate. So there's a limited set of parameters that are required to estimate what the impacts are that lead into that decision logic of where you might go with the endpoint. And I think other sites can certainly take advantage of that and apply the suite tool to make those estimates. Where you might need some additional information is possibly on the source strength and location. I mean, that tends to be one of the more uncertain parameters where you don't always know exactly how big this is or what's the strength of that source. And the guidance document talks about how to do some of that assessment in terms of looking at mass discharge in rebound studies. You might, depending on which wells you have, you might need some additional wells, but you can get a better handle on that. And then the suite tool is actually a spreadsheet-based tool. So it's quick to do what-if analyses to look at a range of input parameters if some of those are more uncertain. So definitely, you don't have to be as well characterized as Hanford to use this approach.
Well, that's kind of very important. Yeah, pretty well explained. Thanks, Chris. And here's another one. Why was methylene chloride present, and why isn't it considered more directly in the studies such as this one that you guys presented?
Yeah. The liquids disposed of did include organics. So there was some anaerobic biodegradation that produced methylene chloride at an earlier time. The absence of conditions suitable for microbial populations means that there is no continuing source of methylene chloride.
Okay. And another question that I thought it was pretty interesting and important. What has monitoring observed since the recommendation to shut down the SVE system was accepted?
Well, after a 3-year rebound study, carbon tetrachloride and methylene chloride concentrations in the soil gas remain below the action levels, of 100 ppmb and 50 ppmb, with the exception of those 2 instances I pointed out on the slides. Based on this, the EPA signed our DOERL-2014-48 document, which provided us the authorization to begin our permanent shutdown of the soil vapor extraction operations. And for that reason, there was no need for any additional monitoring.
Yeah. All right. And we do have a question coming from Mark White. Do you have a sense of the form of the carbon tetrachloride in the caliche layer? Is it vapor or liquid?
So Mark, you can feel free to jump in here. I don't think that we've directly sampled that. Essentially, you're asking, is there an apple in the
yeah.
Cold Creek unit? And I don't know that we've directly sampled that, but the constant soil gas concentrations would not indicate that there's a lot of liquid there. Right? The soil gas concentrations are pretty low. So I think it's going to be, well, there may be some liquid, but not a lot. It's primarily carbon that diffused into the caliche, this fine grained unit over time, and it was retained there just because the mass transfer out of there is very, very slow.
What I recall, Chris, from that also, we did look for DNAPL during the investigations, and that I remember a couple of instances, there were some very small traces of DNAPL observed, but for the most part, that wasn't an issue. So that's consistent with what you're saying.
Right.
Great. I don't see any more questions coming our way here. So at this point, I would like to thank you everyone for joining our seminar today. Just a reminder that today's seminar will be archived on our RemPlex website, just like the other seminars that we have presented so far. We look forward to presenting our next seminar on modeling and measuring the transport of foam in porous media in the presence of nanoparticles. And this seminar will be presented by Professor Valentina Prijobe of Stevens Institute of Technology, and we are excited about it. And this seminar will be scheduled during the month of February. We also encourage you to sign up for our RemPlex newsletter by sending an email to remplex@pnnl.gov. And also please consider to join the LinkedIn group using the link that is provided in the chat box. Well, thank you very much. Thanks again, Chris and Mark, for a very, very important and interesting presentation. And thank you very much to everybody that attended today's seminar. We will talk and we'll see you guys soon. Thanks again.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.